Peter Chadwick's voice was trembling on the 911 call. His words rushed and frantic. "My wife! She's dead! Someone broke in and killed her." The dispatcher's voice cut through the panic, asking him to remain calm, but his words became more erratic with each sentence. The house, his mansion in the upscale neighborhood of Newport Beach, should have been a sanctuary, but now it was the scene of horror. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Peter standing in the living room, eyes wide, his hands shaking, but his demeanor was strangely calm. A sudden burst of tension filled the air as officers quickly took control, asking him questions about the supposed intruder. The urgency of the situation contrasted sharply with Peter's demeanor. He seemed almost too composed. "We have a break-in. I heard a noise, came downstairs and found her dead. I couldn't do anything," Peter stammered. Yet something didn't add up. The officers searched the house, scanning for any signs of forced entry, any clues that could explain what happened. There was nothing. The doors were locked. The windows were intact. No sign of struggle, no signs of violent force. A perfect break-in, if only the intruder had left evidence. Detective Monroe, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for detail, arrived at the scene. As he watched Peter, something about the scene didn't sit right. The house was immaculate, too perfect, too still. The silence was deafening. Monroe noted Peter's odd calmness. He wasn't distraught. He wasn't behaving like a man whose wife had just been murdered. The detective's instincts were on high alert. "Tell me again exactly what happened," Monroe asked, his voice steady but probing. Peter repeated his story, but this time there was an edge of confusion in his tone, as if he were piecing together a story he had rehearsed. As Peter spoke, Monroe glanced around the room, his mind racing. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no overturned furniture, a murder scene without any struggle. Monroe's mind shifted to another troubling thought. "What about the body?" he asked. Peter's expression faltered, but only briefly. "They took her somewhere. I don't know, I just heard the noise and it was too late." The longer Peter spoke, the more Monroe doubted him. The man's grief seemed mechanical, practiced. Something was wrong. Monroe's gut told him that Peter wasn't telling the whole truth. But what was it? Why was he acting so strangely? Suddenly a call came in. They'd found something. Monroe's heart raced as the officer on the other end informed him that Quee Choo Lim's body had been discovered 160 miles away in a remote canyon near San Diego. The body was dumped in a trash bin, far from the home, discarded like a piece of garbage. The shock of it hit Monroe like a punch to the stomach. "This doesn't make sense," Monroe muttered under his breath. The idea of a random break-in became increasingly unlikely. Why would the killer travel so far to dump the body? Was it a staged crime scene? Was Peter Chadwick involved in his wife's murder? Monroe had too many questions and too few answers. Peter, still standing by the front door, looked out at the detectives searching the area. He was watching them intently, but there was no fear in his eyes, no panic, just a strange, unreadable calm. It was as if he was watching his own fate unfold but had no real stake in it. Monroe's suspicion deepened. The body wasn't just discarded, it was hidden, and whoever had done it had taken great care to erase any signs of the crime. A chilling realization crept into Monroe's mind. The killer hadn't just murdered Quee Choo Lim, they'd planned it. And Peter Chadwick? He was the one person who had the most to gain from her death. With a heavy sigh, Monroe signaled to his team, "We're not dealing with a simple break-in. We've got a lot of work to do. Let's bring him in." As the officers began to gather evidence, Peter Chadwick was left standing alone, his thoughts unreadable. His wife was dead, but the truth, his truth, was still buried beneath layers of lies. Monroe knew the case was only beginning, and he had no idea how far down the rabbit hole it would go. The investigation was in full swing, and Detective Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He had seen many cases, but Peter Chadwick's behavior was raising red flags. On the surface, Peter's story about the murder seemed tragic, but something about it wasn't adding up. Monroe's instincts told him that Peter knew far more than he was letting on. A few hours after the crime scene investigation, Monroe sat across from Peter in a sterile interrogation room, staring at him intently. The man seemed too calm for someone whose life had just been shattered. His eyes, despite their bloodshot appearance, lacked the despair one would expect from a grieving husband. Instead, there was a coldness to his gaze, an eerie detachment that Monroe couldn't ignore. "So, Peter," Monroe began, keeping his voice neutral, "you say you were home when the break-in occurred. Can you walk me through it again?" Peter nodded, his voice steady but slightly too rehearsed. I was in my study, working late. I heard a noise downstairs, then I found her. His words faltered for a brief moment, but only briefly. It was too late, she was already gone. Monroe leaned forward, carefully studying Peter's every word. You mentioned hearing a noise. What exactly did that sound like? Peter hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting to the side. I don't know. Just a crash, a loud noise. I thought someone was breaking in. He rubbed his temples, clearly uncomfortable with the questioning. Monroe's suspicion deepened. Peter's responses seemed scripted. A home invasion, a crash, his wife dead. But there was no sign of forced entry. The more Monroe thought about it, the more the details didn't line up. The house had no broken locks, no shattered windows. The crime scene was too neat, too controlled. No intruder would have been able to stage the scene so perfectly. It was as if the killer knew exactly what they were doing, and Monroe's gut told him it was someone who had been inside the house before. Peter, Monroe said softly, his voice calm but firm. Where was the body found? Peter's face tightened for a moment. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. They found her, in a trash bin. I don't know how she got there, but... He trailed off, almost as if the words were too much to speak. Monroe's mind raced. Why would the killer, if Peter was telling the truth, go through the trouble of driving his wife's body so far away, dumping it in a remote canyon? This didn't seem like a spur-of-the-moment crime. This was calculated. The fact that Peter's emotions seemed so controlled only added fuel to the growing fire of suspicion. Peter's life, as Monroe soon discovered, wasn't as perfect as it seemed. While Peter had managed to present an image of success and wealth, the detective uncovered troubling details about the Chadwick family's finances. Peter had been drowning in debt. His real estate business was on the brink of collapse, and he was desperate. More than that, Monroe learned that Peter had recently taken out a massive life insurance policy on his wife. The payout was substantial, a sum that could have solved his financial problems overnight. The final piece of the puzzle came when Monroe checked Peter's phone records. There had been no calls made during the time of the supposed break-in, no attempts to contact 911 before Peter finally made the call, which was an odd detail for someone who claimed to have been frightened and desperate. It became increasingly clear to Monroe that Peter had been hiding something. Your story isn't adding up, Peter, Monroe said, watching him carefully. Peter stared back, his expression unchanging. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something Monroe could only describe as fear. Or was it something else? Guilt? I told you everything I know, Peter insisted, his voice suddenly wavering. I don't know why this happened. I don't know why she's gone. Monroe leaned back, his eyes narrowing. It was clear that Peter was lying, but to what extent? Did he pull the trigger himself, or had he orchestrated it all? Monroe was convinced that Peter wasn't just a grieving husband caught in a tragic event. He was a man who had planned and executed his wife's murder with chilling precision. As Monroe stood up, preparing to leave the room, he looked back at Peter one last time. There was no longer any doubt in his mind. Peter Chadwick wasn't a victim. He was the killer. But the question remained, what drove him to kill his wife? Was it just money? Or was there something deeper, darker, that Peter wasn't ready to admit? Keep thinking about your story, Peter, Monroe said before walking out. We'll be back for you soon. The truth behind Peter Chadwick's marriage to Quee Choo Lim wasn't as perfect as it had appeared on the surface. As Detective Monroe delved deeper into their personal lives, unsettling revelations began to emerge. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Peter Chadwick wasn't just dealing with financial stress. He was hiding a dark side, and it was taking its toll on his marriage. The first breakthrough came when Monroe spoke to friends and colleagues of Quee Choo Lim. Several people described her as a woman who had always been kind, caring, and dedicated to her family. She was the kind of person who believed in the power of loyalty and support. But as Monroe spoke to more people, a different side of her relationship with Peter began to surface. Quee Choo had confided in a close friend just weeks before her death. She spoke of her increasing fears about Peter's temper and his fixation on money. Though Peter appeared to be a successful businessman, his mounting debts were becoming impossible to ignore. He had been borrowing money from business partners and investors with no way to pay it back. Quee Choo had tried to help, but the pressure of keeping up appearances was overwhelming for both of them. Their life was a carefully constructed facade, but underneath it all, cracks were beginning to show. The most chilling revelation came from a conversation Quee Choo had had with her therapist. She had voiced concerns about Peter's growing volatility. There were whispers of arguments at home, late-night shouting matches that had disturbed the peace of their neighborhood. Yet no one outside the household could have guessed how serious it had become. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple, successful, wealthy, admired by their peers. But in private, Peter's emotional control seemed to be slipping. Monroe also spoke with several of Peter's former business partners. Their accounts painted a picture of a man who was constantly in financial trouble, but who never showed signs of being desperate. Instead, Peter's charm and confidence were his tools. He used his reputation as a successful businessman to manipulate and deceive people into believing he was in control. He had always been able to talk his way out of tight situations, but recently those situations had become harder to escape. One former partner revealed that Peter had once casually mentioned to him, "It would be such a shame if something were to happen to Quee Choo." The comment had been dismissed at the time as a joke, but in retrospect it now seemed far more sinister. Monroe couldn't help but wonder if Peter had been toying with the idea of murder long before it ever happened. As Monroe continued his investigation, he found an even darker secret hidden in the Chadwick family's finances. Peter had recently taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Quee Choo. The payout would be enough to solve his financial woes, far more than he could have ever hoped to recover through his failing business. It was a classic case of financial desperation, but with a dangerous, cold-blooded twist. Monroe dug deeper, uncovering records that showed Peter had been in constant contact with insurance brokers, subtly making sure that all the paperwork was in order, just in case something were to happen. The meticulousness with which Peter had planned his financial future raised new questions. Had he been preparing for this moment, the moment when he would take everything, including his wife's life, in order to escape his problems? Then came the shocking discovery. Peter had been withdrawing large sums of money in the weeks leading up to the murder. It was as if he knew something was coming. As Monroe analyzed the financial records, it became clear that Peter had planned every detail. The murder wasn't an impulsive act of rage. It had been coldly calculated, carefully orchestrated, and executed with a level of precision that made Peter's initial shock at the crime scene even more disturbing. Monroe stood still for a moment, piecing together the web of lies that Peter had spun. The life insurance policy, the constant money withdrawals, the growing tensions within the marriage, everything pointed to one horrifying truth. Peter had murdered his wife, but the reason was not just money. It was a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating weight of his own failures. And as Peter sat in his interrogation room, the walls closing in on him, Monroe knew he was only beginning to uncover the full extent of the deception. There was still more to discover, more to expose. But one thing was clear: Peter Chadwick's secrets were far darker than anyone had imagined. Monroe looked at the papers in front of him, feeling the weight of what was to come. The murder was only part of the story. The real story was about a man who had chosen greed and pride over everything else, even the life of the woman who had once been his partner. The night of the murder wasn't a chaotic flurry of emotion. It was calculated. It was deliberate. Peter Chadwick had planned everything down to the smallest detail. His wife, Quee Choo Lim, had become an obstacle, a financial burden he was no longer willing to carry. He had convinced himself that her death was the only way out, the only solution to the mountain of debt and the crushing weight of his failing business. Peter, who once seemed the picture of success, had become a man on the edge, and his desire for freedom had blinded him to everything else. As the evening unfolded, Peter pretended to go about his usual routine. The house, as always, was quiet. The weight of the night felt different this time. He knew that when the clock struck midnight, things would never be the same. His thoughts were racing, but his movements were calm. He moved like a man who had rehearsed this moment over and over in his mind. There was no panic in his eyes, only a chilling sense of purpose. Quee Choo Lim had no idea what was coming. She had gone to bed early, as she always did, trusting that everything in her world was as it should be. Her husband was in the next room, working on his latest project, just as he had done the night before. There was no reason for suspicion, no indication that this night would be any different from the countless others. But Peter had planned it for weeks. He had bought the tools he needed, studied the details of her life insurance policy, and carefully planned how to cover his tracks. In his mind, everything was in place. His alibi was flawless, and the crime would look like a random break-in. He had rehearsed it all, down to the last detail. The moment arrived, and Peter crept into their bedroom. Quee Choo was fast asleep, unaware that the man she loved was about to destroy everything. Peter stood over her, his mind focused. For a moment, doubt flickered, but it quickly vanished. The plan had been set in motion long ago, and there was no turning back. He used a pillow to suffocate her, his hands steady despite the enormity of the act. He couldn't afford to leave any traces, no signs of a struggle, no marks that could link him to the crime. Quee Choo's body went limp in a matter of minutes. Peter stared at her, emotionless. The woman who had once been his partner, his equal, was now a lifeless corpse. The next step was simple: dispose of the body, but even that wasn't left to chance. Peter had thought this part through as well. He would stage the crime scene to look like a botched robbery, leaving no trace of his involvement. He dragged her body out of bed, lifting it with unnatural care. His mind raced as he moved her through the house, careful not to make a sound. In the garage, he had prepared a trash bag, just as he had imagined. The plan was to make it look as though the body had been taken by a thief, discarded carelessly in a random spot miles away from the house. He stuffed Quee Choo's body into the bag, sealing it tight. Every movement was calculated. There was no room for error. The body would be disposed of far from their home, ensuring that no one would connect the murder to him. Peter knew he had to act fast. The police would soon be on their way, and he had already prepared the story he would tell. He would be the grieving husband, the helpless man who had come home to find his wife murdered by an intruder. It was the perfect cover, and it was foolproof, at least in his mind. He loaded the trash bag into the car and drove for hours, leaving their upscale neighborhood behind. He took the back roads, ensuring no one would see him. The body was dumped in a remote canyon near San Diego, the perfect spot to discard the evidence without a trace. He felt a brief surge of relief as he abandoned her, the woman he had once promised to love and protect. It was over now. By the time Peter returned home, the police had already arrived. He acted the part, his grief apparent as he reported the so-called home invasion. His voice trembled as he described what he had found, his emotions raw. At least, that's how he made it seem. The officers took his statement and began their investigation, unaware that the man standing before them was the very one responsible for the crime. As the police began to search the house, Peter stood by, watching with false concern. Every word he spoke seemed designed to divert attention from himself, to make them believe that he was the victim in all of this. But deep down, Peter knew that his plan had been executed flawlessly. He had covered his tracks, and there was nothing that could tie him to the murder. The next morning, the truth began to emerge, but Peter was already several steps ahead. The murder was nothing more than a tragic act of fate, and he, Peter Chadwick, would go on with his life, free of the burden of debt, free from the ties that had once bound him to Quee Choo. He was no longer the man he had been. In his mind, he was free. But as Detective Monroe started piecing together the facts, a different story began to take shape, one that would soon expose the chilling reality of what had really happened on that fateful night. Peter Chadwick had made a decision, and it was final. The walls were closing in on him. The investigation was intensifying, and every moment he stayed in Newport Beach was another moment that risked exposing him. With a cold resolve, Peter knew it was time to disappear. The morning after his wife's body was discovered, Peter put his plan into motion. He had already taken out the life insurance policy, gotten rid of much of his property, and secured the cash that he needed. No one would suspect that a man under the weight of suspicion could escape so easily. But Peter had been meticulous, always calculating, and always one step ahead. The detectives were swarming around his life, probing into his finances, interviewing his colleagues, and looking into his every move. Yet Peter remained strangely calm. His behavior had already aroused suspicion, but no one yet knew the extent of his plan. He was no longer the same man who had once been a successful businessman. That man had been replaced by a fugitive, a man who had nothing left to lose. Peter's escape wasn't immediate. He had spent months preparing for this moment. He sold off assets, liquidated bank accounts, and removed all traces that could link him to the crime. He closed his business operations, paid off anyone he owed, and erased every financial record that might lead back to him. The final step was simple: to vanish. He had made all the arrangements. A well-worn route across the U.S.-Mexico border was where he would cross next. He wasn't heading to a remote town or someplace where he could hide for long. No, Peter's plan was different. He'd blend in. He'd disappear into the anonymity of Mexico, using false identification, disappearing into the crowd. The night before his departure, Peter left a message for his lawyer, a cryptic note that seemed to suggest nothing more than a routine business trip. He had made sure his alibi would hold up for the next few days, just long enough for the investigation to become distracted by his sudden absence. The police would search for him, but they wouldn't know where to look. With a final glance at the home he'd once shared with Quee Choo, Peter drove away. His heart didn't race, no panic set in. Instead, there was a coldness to his departure. He felt as though he was shedding an old life, a life that had become burdensome and unsustainable. He had no intention of being found, not until he was ready, and right now, he was ready to disappear. By the time the police realized he had fled, Peter was already across the border. His face, his name, everything about him had already been altered. The life he had once known, the life he had built on lies and deception, was now behind him. For nearly 5 years, Peter would live in a quiet, unremarkable town in Mexico. He lived under a new name with a new identity, using the money he'd taken to live comfortably. He avoided drawing attention to himself, never staying in one place for too long. He blended into the life of a man who had no past, no history to be traced. But as the months turned to years, Peter began to feel the weight of his decision. At first, the freedom was intoxicating. No more financial pressure, no more constant lies to uphold. He could live his life without the crushing guilt that had once haunted him. But over time, the guilt crept back in ways that he couldn't shake. Every time he saw a police car, every time someone came too close, the fear returned. Would they find him? Would they track him down and drag him back to the U.S. to face justice? Yet Peter refused to look back. He had escaped, and as far as he was concerned, it was too late to undo what had been done. His wife was gone, and the money he had stolen from her death was in his possession. Nothing else mattered. He had won, at least that was what he told himself every day. However, the reality of his escape was far different. The police never stopped searching for him. Every year, more resources were poured into the investigation. Detectives kept reviewing the evidence, the phone records, and even reached out to international law enforcement. Slowly, they were closing in. Peter Chadwick might have thought he could outrun his past, but the truth always has a way of catching up. In August of 2019, Peter's worst fear came true. He was finally tracked down. His identity was uncovered, and he was arrested in Mexico, just as the authorities had predicted. He had been living a lie for years, and now the lie was about to end. As he was escorted to a U.S. prison, Peter felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, anger, even relief. He had thought he could escape the truth, but deep down, he knew that he could never outrun the consequences of his actions. The life he had tried to build in Mexico was now shattered, and he was facing the very thing he had hoped to avoid. Peter Chadwick's escape had been the ultimate act of cowardice, but it also marked the beginning of the end. The walls that had once seemed so far away were now closing in. The nightmare was far from over. It had been 4 years since Peter Chadwick vanished into the night, leaving nothing but questions in his wake. Yet despite the time, the hunt for him never ceased. The police, led by Detective Monroe, were relentless. Every lead, every piece of new information brought them closer to finding him. They knew Peter wasn't just a fugitive. He was a man who had orchestrated a perfect crime, and he had to be brought to justice. Monroe sat in his office, eyes fixed on a map dotted with red pins marking locations all over Mexico. Possible hideouts, places Peter could have slipped through the cracks. It had become personal for Monroe. The case had haunted him for years, and with every passing day, the determination to catch Peter grew stronger. The fact that Peter had outsmarted them for so long only made the desire for justice burn hotter. "We've got something," the voice on the other end of the line broke through Monroe's thoughts. It was an officer from the U.S. Marshals Service, someone who had been working with Monroe for months on this international manhunt. "We've tracked a series of withdrawals from his accounts, small amounts but consistent. They all point to a place in Baja California." Monroe's heart raced. This could be it. This could be the break they had been waiting for. Peter Chadwick had been using an alias, but every step he took was leaving a trail. The money he'd taken from his wife's life insurance policy had been spent cautiously, but not carefully enough. The small withdrawals, the changes in his lifestyle, everything was adding up. Monroe didn't hesitate. Within hours, a team was assembled, and they were on their way to Mexico. The quiet town near the border seemed like an ideal place for a man trying to disappear, isolated, away from the bustle of major cities. But it was also exactly where they would catch him. As the team crossed into Mexico, Monroe couldn't shake the image of Peter, calm, calculating, and now, for the first time, desperate. Peter had been living under a false identity for years, but he was running out of time. The net was closing in on him. "We have a lead on his location," another officer reported over the radio. "Local informants say they've seen someone matching Peter's description in the area. It's not a guarantee, but it's worth investigating." The tension in the air was palpable. Monroe knew that they were getting closer, but the realization that Peter was just ahead, out of sight, made the hunt even more intense. The fugitive had no idea how close they were. Monroe wasn't going to let him slip through his fingers again. The team arrived at a rundown property on the outskirts of the small town. It was a quiet place, no noise, no lights, but it had been identified as one of the possible locations Peter could be hiding. As they approached, Monroe's mind raced through every possible scenario. What if they were too late? What if Peter had already moved on? But there was no time to second guess. Monroe gave the order, and the team fanned out. They moved quietly, each officer covering a different angle. Monroe's heart thudded in his chest as they reached the front door. He had been chasing Peter for years, and now it all came down to this moment. He knocked once sharply. The silence was unbearable. Seconds stretched into what felt like eternity, and then a voice from inside. "Who's there?" Monroe's eyes locked with the others. There was no hesitation. "FBI," he called out. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The door swung open, and there he was, Peter Chadwick, the man who had murdered his wife and disappeared into thin air, now standing before them. His face was gaunt, older than the last time they had seen him, but there was no mistaking it. This was the man who had eluded them for years. For a moment, Peter didn't move. He just stood there, looking at the officers, his eyes betraying no fear, just an unsettling calm. But the moment didn't last long. As the officers moved in to apprehend him, Peter made a sudden attempt to flee, but the chase was short-lived. He wasn't the same man he once was, disoriented and exhausted from years of hiding. As they restrained him, Monroe couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. But there was also something else, a hollow feeling. The case had been solved, but the damage, the lives destroyed by Peter's actions, remained. For all the years of running, for all the money he had stolen from his wife's death, Peter had nothing left. The once wealthy man was now just another fugitive, caught and bound by the very thing he had tried to escape, his own past. Monroe stared at him as the handcuffs clicked shut. "You're done," he said, his voice cold. "You can't run anymore." Peter didn't respond. His silence spoke volumes. A man resigned to the fact that the game was over. The chase had ended, and justice, though delayed, had finally caught up with him. As the officers escorted Peter away, Monroe looked back at the house one last time. The long search was over. The manhunt had come to an end. But the question still lingered. Why had Peter done it? What had driven him to kill his wife, to destroy the life they had built together? These were answers that, for now, would remain buried, hidden deep in Peter Chadwick's mind. Peter Chadwick had been on the run for years, but now the end was finally in sight. The man who thought he could outrun his past was about to be confronted with the consequences of his actions. As the authorities closed in on him, he knew that the life he had been living, fleeing from one hiding place to the next, was about to collapse. The journey from his quiet refuge in Mexico back to the U.S. was one filled with anxiety. For all his careful planning and years of eluding capture, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that this time was different. This time, there would be no escape. His carefully crafted life, built on lies and deceit, had led him to a dead end. Peter had always been able to manipulate people, to talk his way out of tight situations. But now, as he sat in the back of a van, handcuffed and heading to the airport for his return to the U.S., he couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness. There would be no more running, the game was up. But Peter was not a man to give up easily. Even in the face of certain capture, he clung to his belief that he could still somehow slip away. He had always thought that the law couldn't touch him, that he could always outwit the authorities, always find a way to keep his secrets buried. But now, as the weight of his past crimes loomed over him, that belief was beginning to crack. As the van made its way to the airport, Peter's mind raced. Could he somehow escape again? Could he convince someone, anyone, that he was innocent? His mind flashed to the years he had spent evading capture, his fake identities, his careful planning. He had lived with the fear that one day the authorities would catch up to him, but he had always pushed that thought to the back of his mind. Now, it was unavoidable. Peter knew that the evidence against him was overwhelming. There was no way to deny it. The phone records, the financial transactions, the life insurance policy he had taken out on his wife, all of it pointed back to him. But he wasn't ready to give up just yet. He was a master manipulator, and even in his most desperate moments, he couldn't shake the belief that he could still turn things around. As the van pulled into the airport, Peter's heart began to race. He glanced at the officers guarding him, their faces unreadable. They knew what he had done. They knew he was guilty. And yet, Peter still held on to one final hope, that he could turn the tide in his favor, just as he had so many times before. But as the door to the van opened and the officers began to lead him towards the airport terminal, Peter's resolve started to crumble. The familiar feeling of invincibility that had once driven him was gone. There was no escape this time. He was out of options, trapped in a situation that no amount of manipulation or charm could get him out of. He was led into the building, where he was handed over to U.S. authorities. As they placed him in a holding cell, Peter's thoughts turned inward. This was it. The final chapter of his escape had come to an end. There was no more running, no more lies. The man who had so carefully planned his wife's murder to escape his financial ruin was now facing the consequences of his actions. For the first time in years, Peter Chadwick felt a sense of fear, not for his physical safety, but for the truth that was finally catching up with him. He had deceived so many, but now there was nowhere left to hide. As he sat in that cold, sterile cell, Peter began to realize the enormity of his crime. His wife's death had been nothing more than a means to an end that now felt painfully distant. The wealth he had sought, the life he had dreamed of, had led him here, to this moment of reckoning. He had wanted to escape his failures, but in doing so, he had created his own undoing. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside his cell. The door opened, and a guard stepped in. "It's time," he said curtly, offering Peter no sympathy. Peter stood slowly, the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. As he was led away for his extradition, he couldn't help but wonder, was this the moment he would finally face justice? Peter Chadwick's great escape was over, but the price of his freedom had been too high. There was no more running. The truth would be laid bare, and he would have to answer for what he had done. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The day had finally come. Peter Chadwick, once a wealthy real estate mogul, was about to face the consequences of his actions. After years of evading justice, the murderer was now standing before the very system he had thought he could outrun. The trial was more than just a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning, a moment where the truth would be laid bare. Detective Monroe sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as Peter Chadwick was led in, shackled and subdued. The man who had once been a figure of power and influence now seemed diminished, reduced to a shadow of his former self. His once confident demeanor had faded. The carefully crafted image of success was gone, replaced by the cold reality of the crime he had committed. Peter's eyes darted nervously around the courtroom, avoiding direct contact with the victim's family, who sat in the front row. The weight of their gaze, of their grief, was something he could no longer ignore, but he wasn't ready to admit his guilt. Not yet. The trial began with the prosecution laying out their case, detailing the events that led to the murder of Quee Choo Lim. They presented the evidence, the financial records, the life insurance policy, the phone records showing Peter's suspicious behavior, and the overwhelming forensic evidence that linked him directly to the crime scene. Each piece of evidence was a nail in Peter's coffin, but he still refused to acknowledge his role in his wife's death. The prosecutor was relentless, building the case step by step, demonstrating how Peter's actions were premeditated, calculated, and cold. The prosecution revealed how Peter had planned every detail, right down to the staged break-in and the careful disposal of his wife's body. They painted a picture of a man willing to sacrifice everything, even the woman he had promised to love, in order to escape his financial ruin. Peter sat stoically, his face expressionless, as the evidence stacked against him. He seemed detached from the proceedings, as if the reality of what he had done had yet to sink in. But deep down, Peter knew the truth was catching up with him. He could feel the walls closing in. The defense, however, was determined to paint a different picture. They argued that Peter was a man under extreme stress, a man who had suffered years of financial turmoil. They suggested that the pressure of his mounting debts and the strain of his failing business had pushed him to the edge. But the jury wasn't buying it. They saw through the defense's weak attempts to humanize Peter. They saw the man who had coldly murdered his wife for money, for freedom, and for a future that no longer existed. As the defense rested their case, Peter's lawyer made one last-ditch attempt to sway the jury's opinion. They tried to claim that Peter had been suffering from temporary insanity, unable to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions at the time of the murder. It was a desperate plea for sympathy, but it fell on deaf ears. The jury was unmoved. Then, it was time for the victim's family to speak. Quee Choo Lim's mother, father, and siblings took the stand, their voices trembling with grief as they described the woman they had lost. They spoke of her kindness, her dedication to her family, and the devastation they felt knowing that she had been taken so violently. The emotional weight of their words left the courtroom silent, the truth undeniable. Peter's face remained impassive as the family's words echoed in his mind. He couldn't bring himself to look at them, the guilt too overwhelming to bear. But no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, the truth was inescapable. He had killed the woman he had promised to protect, the woman who had given him everything. The final day of the trial arrived, and the jury deliberated. Monroe sat in the courthouse waiting, the tension building as the minutes stretched into hours. He knew the evidence had been strong. There was no way Peter could escape the truth this time, and yet part of him feared the verdict. Peter's manipulative charm had always been his strength, but this time, there was no getting around the facts. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, the courtroom fell silent. The judge called for order, and Peter's fate was sealed. He was found guilty of second-degree murder. The relief in the courtroom was palpable, but it was tinged with sadness. There would be no celebration, no joy in the victory. Justice had been served, but it came at a cost that could never be undone. Peter Chadwick was sentenced to 15 years in prison. It wasn't the death sentence that many had hoped for, but it was the best that could be done. As the gavel came down, Peter was led away, his face still devoid of emotion. The man who had once thought he could outrun justice had been caught, and while his future was uncertain, the truth was now clear. For Detective Monroe, the case had come to an end. But for the family of Quee Choo Lim, the healing would take much longer. Their lives had been shattered, but they had found closure in the conviction of the man who had taken everything from them. The trial had been a brutal reminder of the cost of greed, the price of betrayal, and the power of justice. For Peter Chadwick, there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury filed back in after their deliberation. The long, drawn-out trial of Peter Chadwick had reached its final chapter. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood, holding the fate of the defendant in his hands. Peter sat in his seat, his expression unreadable, but his eyes flickered nervously toward the jury. He had spent years evading justice, but now the moment of reckoning had arrived. For the victim's family, it was an emotional moment. They had waited so long for this day, the day when they would finally see the man who had taken their loved one's life held accountable. Quee Choo Lim's parents sat in the front row, their faces a mixture of grief, exhaustion, and hope. They had spent years mourning their daughter's death, but today, the long road to justice was coming to a close. The judge's voice broke the silence as he asked the jury foreman to read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Peter Chadwick, guilty of second-degree murder." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. There was no outburst, no gasps from the courtroom, but the sense of finality was overwhelming. Peter's face remained impassive, but inside, his mind was racing. The verdict wasn't what he had hoped for. Despite his manipulations, despite his attempts to escape, he was now facing the consequences of his actions. The judge called for order, but the emotions in the room were impossible to ignore. The victim's family exchanged glances, relief, sorrow, and a sense of justice served. It wasn't the death penalty that many had hoped for, but it was justice nonetheless. They could now begin the long, painful process of healing. Peter's defense lawyer stood, motioning for a moment to address the court. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, We respectfully request a lighter sentence for Mr. Chadwick, considering the stress he was under at the time of the crime. The years of financial strain, his deteriorating mental state, and the pressure of his business collapse led to this tragic event." The words fell flat. The jury had already spoken. Peter's attempt to manipulate the system, to portray himself as a victim of circumstance, had failed. There was no sympathy left for him. The courtroom, filled with the echoes of justice finally being served, made it clear that his actions were inexcusable. Monroe, who had worked tirelessly on this case for years, stood in the back of the room, watching as the judge addressed Peter. For him, this was more than just a case. It was the culmination of a long search for truth. Peter had evaded justice for so long, but now, finally, the truth was out, and the consequences were inevitable. The judge turned to Peter, his voice calm but stern. "Peter Chadwick, you have been found guilty of second-degree murder, for the life of your wife, for the lies you've told, and for the years you've spent evading justice. You will be sentenced to 15 years in prison." Peter's face remained emotionless, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something: resentment, fear, perhaps even the realization that he was finally facing the reality of his actions. The courtroom erupted into a mix of emotions. Some felt relief, others angered by the fact that Peter would not face a harsher punishment. But regardless of how they felt, there was a sense of finality. Peter had been caught, and now he would serve his time. As the gavel came down, marking the end of the trial, Peter was led away in handcuffs. The man who had once been a wealthy, successful businessman was now just another prisoner, facing the consequences of his actions. But the emotional toll of his crime on his family, on Quee Choo Lim's family, and on the people who had believed in him would linger long after his sentence was served. For the victim's family, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back the woman they had lost. It couldn't undo the pain they had carried for years. Yet, there was a sense of closure in knowing that Peter would pay for what he had done. He could no longer hide behind his lies, no longer escape the consequences. As Peter was escorted out of the courtroom, Detective Monroe couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. The case had been long and arduous, but it was finally over. He had brought a killer to justice, but it had come at a steep price. Peter Chadwick's crimes were a tragic reminder of how far greed and deception could take a person. But in the end, the truth had prevailed. The courtroom was quiet after the verdict, but the real aftermath had only just begun. Peter Chadwick was behind bars, but for the people who had been affected by his actions, the scars would take much longer to heal. Justice had been served, but it was a hollow victory. The life that had been lost could never be brought back. Quee Choo Lim's family had hoped for more. They had wanted the death penalty, the ultimate punishment for the man who had taken their daughter's life. But the reality of the legal system meant that Peter would only serve 15 years for his cold-blooded murder. It was a sentence that felt like a compromise, a hard pill to swallow, but one that had to be accepted. Monroe stood alone in his office after the trial, staring at the case file on his desk. The case had consumed him for years. The pursuit of Peter Chadwick had been relentless, but it wasn't just the manhunt that had weighed on him. It was the emotional toll of the case. Monroe had seen a lot of things in his career, but nothing like this. Peter's betrayal, the calculated murder of a wife, the way he discarded her life as though it meant nothing. It had taken something out of Monroe. It had shaken him in a way few cases ever had. But the case was closed. Peter was in prison. The family would never be whole again, but at least they had justice, however incomplete it might feel. The trial was over, and yet the shadows of what Peter had done still loomed large. For Peter, the reality of his new life behind bars had settled in. No longer the successful businessman, no longer the man who could talk his way out of trouble. He was just another inmate, serving time for the crime he had committed. His wealth, his manipulations, and his escape were now meaningless. All he had left was time, and the cold realization that no amount of money could undo what he had done. His once polished life had disintegrated into a prison sentence. Inside his cell, Peter began to reflect on the choices that had led him to this moment. He had always prided himself on being clever, on outsmarting everyone around him. But now, as he sat in solitude, the cost of his actions became painfully clear. The wealth he had stolen from his wife's death wasn't worth the price he'd paid. It wasn't worth the years he would spend behind bars, and it certainly wasn't worth the pain he had caused. But the remorse Peter felt wasn't the kind that might lead to redemption. It was a hollow, self-serving guilt. Guilt not for what he had done to Quee Choo, but for what he had lost. He missed his freedom, he missed the life of luxury he had once enjoyed, and he missed the power he had held. But it was too late. The walls of his prison cell were now his only reality. For Quee Choo's family, the pain of her death was still raw. They had gained closure with the verdict, but closure didn't mean healing. They would never be able to fill the void left by their daughter's tragic death. No sentence could bring her back. No amount of justice could undo the years they had spent wondering what had happened, why it had happened. Her parents, though grateful for the conviction, still struggled with the deep sadness of losing their child. The trial had been a moment of finality, but the grief remained. They would never truly recover from their loss, and the shadows of Peter's actions would always hang over them. Yet, despite the pain, there was a sense of strength that had emerged from the ordeal. The family had come together to seek justice, and they had found it. The bond between them had only grown stronger, and they found solace in knowing that Peter Chadwick could no longer hurt anyone else. For Detective Monroe, the end of the case was bittersweet. He had done his job. He had brought a killer to justice. But the case had taken a toll on him. The emotional weight of it had lingered, and he found himself questioning the world he lived in. How far could someone go for money? How much could a person lose before they lost their humanity? Peter Chadwick had crossed that line, and Monroe had been forced to witness the destruction it caused. The case was over, but for everyone involved, it was just the beginning of a long journey toward healing. The family would carry on, but the loss would never fade. Peter would serve his sentence, but the damage he had caused would be felt long after his time behind bars had ended. For Quee Choo Lim's family, the justice they had fought for was a small victory in the face of an immeasurable loss. But it was justice. And in a world where too many people go unpunished for their crimes, that was something they could hold on to. As for Peter, the man who had once believed that money and power could solve all his problems, the truth had finally caught up to him. He had run, he had hidden, but in the end, there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. And now, as he sat in a prison cell, Peter would have nothing but time to reflect on the woman he had murdered and the life he had destroyed. The aftermath was messy, painful, and far from perfect. But in the end, justice had been served. What do you think of Peter Chadwick's actions? Was justice truly served, or should he have received a harsher sentence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new true crime story.